Chapter 1, The Arrival. It was a grey afternoon when Dr. Evelyn Hart arrived at Ashford Manor. The train had been delayed, as usual, and the rain had begun to pour as soon as she stepped off the platform. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, feeling the chill seep into her bones as she gazed up at the sprawling mansion that loomed before her. Ashford Manor was the kind of place you read about in Gothic novels, an ancient, crumbling estate, tucked away at the edge of the forest, a place where the wind howled through the trees like the cries of the long dead. It had been abandoned for years, its once grand halls now home to only rats, dust, and whispered rumors. Yet, Evelyn was here for a reason. She was a historian, specializing in the strange and obscure, and Ashford Manor had been a mystery for as long as anyone could remember. Her contact, a distant relative she had never met, had sent for her. The letter had been vague, speaking of an inheritance, of family secrets, and of the peculiar happenings within the manor's decaying walls. Evelyn's curiosity had gotten the better of her, and now, standing before the mansion, she regretted nothing. The heavy oak doors creaked open before her, as if expecting her. The butler, an old man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, led her inside without a word. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and every step she took seemed to echo unnaturally in the vast emptiness of the foyer. "I'll show you to your room, Miss Hart," the butler murmured, his voice low and strained. Evelyn nodded but couldn't help but ask, "Who else is here?" "Only you, miss." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Just me?" The man paused for a moment, his eyes shifting nervously. "Yes, miss. Only you." They ascended the grand staircase in silence, the wood groaning beneath their feet as if it, too, were weary of the passage of time. When they reached the second floor, the butler led her down a narrow corridor, stopping at a door that seemed as old and worn as the rest of the house. "This is your room," he said, opening the door and stepping aside. Evelyn entered, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The room was large, with heavy drapes that blocked out most of the light, and an enormous four-poster bed draped in dusty white linen. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, though the warmth did little to dispel the cold that seemed to settle into her skin. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The butler nodded curtly and turned to leave, but before he closed the door, he added in a hushed tone, "Do not go to the west wing, miss. Not after dark." The door clicked shut, leaving Evelyn alone in the oppressive silence of Ashford Manor. Chapter 2, The Forbidden Wing. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed, she could hear the wind howling outside, the storm raging against the manor's walls. It sounded almost like a warning, a foreboding call to something hidden deep within the house. She turned restlessly beneath the covers, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her since her arrival. Her mind wandered to the butler's strange words. The West Wing. She couldn't understand why he would warn her so cryptically. What was it about that part of the house that made it off limits? Was it simply an old superstition, or was there something more to it? Her curiosity got the better of her. She rose from the bed, pulling on her robe and moving toward the door. The hall was dark, but she could just make out the faint outline of the grand staircase leading down into the lower levels. She hesitated for a moment, listening. Everything was eerily still. Quietly, she made her way through the dark corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Her heart raced in her chest as she approached the west wing, a part of the house she had not yet explored. The door was old, its wood dark and cracked with age. Without thinking, she reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your very soul. As she stepped forward, she could hear faint sounds, almost like whispers, coming from the shadows, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakably present. She moved further down the hall, her breath coming in shallow gasps, until she reached a door at the far end. It was ajar, and the light that spilled from the crack in the doorway seemed to flicker unnaturally, like a dying candle. Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast, filled with dust-covered furniture and rotting bookshelves. But what caught her attention was the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was framed in gold, though tarnished with age, and reflected nothing of the room around it. Instead, the glass shimmered like water, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. Turning quickly, Evelyn gasped as she saw a figure in the doorway. A woman, pale and gaunt, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. "Do you see it?" the woman whispered, her voice low and breathy. "Do you see what lies within?" Evelyn's blood ran cold as she backed away, but the woman followed her, her movements unnaturally slow yet deliberate. "It waits," the woman continued, her eyes wide with something unnatural. With a scream, Evelyn turned and fled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Chapter 3: The Voices in the Walls. The following days passed in a haze. Evelyn's nights were filled with restless dreams, and every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the woman's twisted face, the way her eyes seemed to gleam with some terrible knowledge. She had to know more about what was happening at Ashford Manor, but the more she investigated, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. The butler had been strangely absent since the night in the West Wing. No matter how many times she rang for him, no one answered. It was as if the house itself had swallowed him whole. Evelyn spent her days searching through the manor, poking through old journals and diaries that had been left behind, hoping to find some clue as to the manor's history. It wasn't until she came across a letter, tucked between the pages of a forgotten book, that she began to understand. The letter was dated from 1847, written by none other than the previous owner of the manor, a man named Jonathan Ashford. It spoke of dark rituals, of a pact made with forces beyond comprehension, and of the Hollow, a place beneath the manor where something terrible was bound. It was then that Evelyn realized the truth. The West Wing, the mirror, the whispers, they were all connected to something older, something darker than she had ever imagined. The house was alive, and it was feeding on fear. Chapter 4: The Hollow. Determined to confront whatever lay beneath Ashford Manor, Evelyn ventured down into the cellar. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in around her as she descended deeper into the earth. The faint sound of whispers filled her ears again, growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a heavy iron door, its surface rusted and covered in strange markings. With trembling hands, she pushed it open. The room beyond was vast and cavernous, the ceiling lost in darkness. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, covered in symbols she didn't understand. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and as she stepped forward, the whispers turned into anguished screams. Evelyn turned, but it was too late. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure, no, a presence, that filled the room. It was ancient, malevolent, and its eyes burned with an unnatural hunger. "You should have left," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Evelyn backed away, but the darkness closed in around her. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth were swallowing her whole. Chapter 5: The End of Ashford Manor. The next morning, Ashford Manor stood silent once more, the fog thick around its decaying walls. Dr. Evelyn Hart was never seen again. The butler returned to his post, though his eyes were emptier than before. The whispers had stopped, and the manor had returned to its slumber, as though it had never been disturbed. But every so often, when the wind howled through the trees, someone might swear they saw a shadow in the West Wing, a figure staring out from the broken mirror, trapped forever in the hollow of Ashford Manor. And the house, as it always had, waited.